Nerds, I am live right now with Randy Capps from the Migration Policy Institute. You've probably been hearing a lot about the crisis on the southern border around guest worker programs. And obviously, the previous president talked about it a ton. And we have Kamala Harris talking about it. So we're going to try and get into the nitty gritty, get into the nuance, the history with a real expert. And we're going to try and focus on facts and logic and try and think about it from multiple perspectives. But before we do that, we got to get warmed up with Andrew himself.
Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Randy, welcome to the Nerd Zone. How are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Where are you joining us from? Are you in DC or elsewhere?
I am just outside DC in my home office. We're still remote.
Yeah. Now you work for the Migration Policy Institute. Tell us a little bit about that organization and then of course about yourself.
Yeah, we're about 20 years old and actually started right around the time of the September 11th, 2001 attacks when security and immigration were a really big deal. We've been involved in, giving ideas about immigration reform legislation over the years since then and looking at the data and the numbers of immigrants. We have a data hub with lots of facts and figures about nerdy stuff, really, about immigration here. And we have opened an office in Brussels, so we look at immigration issues in Europe as well, and recently also established a Latin American initiative. So we really are trying to take a more global perspective on it, even though we were sort of founded looking at U.S. immigration policy. And that's where I work. I work in our U.S. Immigration Center. I have a background in sociology and demography, so I am a numbers person, but I've also done a lot of work on immigrant integration, issues around immigrant children and families over the years. And I've been with MPI about a dozen years, and before that I worked at another DC-based think tank called the Urban Institute.
Very cool. Can you disclose where does the funding for the MPI come from? Is it associated with a political party or particular interest group, just so that we can put that all on the table? Or how do you guys?
Of course,
look
yeah.
at it?
So we were initially spun out of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It was a program of that and then became an independent 501c3. We're not a lobbying organization or an advocacy group. We really are a research organization, though we make policy proposals. It's been mainline foundations in the U.S. that have provided the bulk of our funding over the years, places like Ford and Carnegie Corporation, MacArthur, Rockefeller, et cetera. That has branched out recently, of course, into the tech foundations like Gates, for instance, Emerson Collective, and others. So we've primarily got a broad base of foundation funding. We do have small government contracts from time to time. Department of Homeland Security has funded some research work over the last few years. And in Europe, it's a combination of European Union, some member governments, and foundation funding that supports that program there.
What would you say is the mission of the MPI?
We really believe that, immigration, we say if immigration well managed can be beneficial both to immigrants and host societies. And so it's our job to describe how that might come about, to make policy proposals for that to come about. That's our basic mission.
Got it. Now, well managed, maybe we could start the conversation in terms of the U.S. Like, how well managed is U.S. immigration today?
Well, we have an old system that has not at its core changed in the last 50 years. 1965 is when we have the legislation that underlies our current system, and it was revised somewhat in 1990. The foundation of it is still very strong. It's based on being open to people regardless of their backgrounds and or origins, but it's based primarily on family ties to people already in the US and secondarily on economics. And that would be ties to jobs or labor market
Hmm.
needs. And so, where it's a little outdated, we believe, is that there could be more emphasis on jobs and matching people who are coming to the country legally with the types of jobs that are available that are needed. And part of the reason why we have 11 million or so unauthorized immigrants is because there's not an adequate legal pathway to match them with the kind of jobs, especially the lower skilled jobs that are available, that drive some of that migration. So we do a very good job in most circumstances of managing the main lawful flow, which is the green card holders or lawful permanent residents. That hasn't been managed well during the pandemic, and so there are big backlogs in that. We have done a decent job at managing temporary worker programs, the H-1Bs for high skill, the tech workers, healthcare, and other workers like that. We have managers who come on L visas. We have a number of temporary programs. There are issues with them, but we let in fairly large numbers of people there, and we have a fairly large and growing agricultural worker program and another lower skilled worker program for hospitality. What we haven't done a very good job is in managing the border, managing the unauthorized immigrant flows that come in, and especially managing the asylum system. The probably biggest weak point right now in our system is the asylum system, with a backlog of several 100,000 cases, more than 1 million overall if you include the other kinds of immigration cases that go through these immigration courts we have. And I think that it's managing that flow of asylum seekers who are coming from Mexico, predominantly Central America, and also increasingly from other parts of the world. That's where we really have problems at the moment.
It's an interesting topic. I mean, I am a son of an immigrant who came to the U.S. in 1970, and I am very grateful for the life that I've been able to have here because of his decision to come over here with my mom. Um, at the same time, I wonder how we can manage what seems to be a ever increasing demand for asylum spots here. When you look at the rest of the world, there are parts of the world like Central America where it's not getting better, and there's there those individuals are acting rationally. They are trying to find a better life. On the other hand, we probably can't host an uncapped number of asylum seekers. How do we how do we kind of get our arms around supply and demand here? How do we get this more sustainable? Because it just doesn't seem like we're at a place where it's very orderly or structured.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, the politics, this is true. This political dysfunction is true in many areas, but it's probably worse in immigration than anywhere else, as we keep like flipping back and forth from one extreme to the other.
Hmm.
When we
Hmm.
change the administration, we have very, very different policies. And part of that, as I mentioned, we haven't updated the actual laws, the immigration laws that form the foundation, but part of it's the polarization. So, what we're looking for is a sustainable middle ground, and you have to take into account, you just start with the fact that there are over 70 million refugees worldwide that need a safe home to go to.
Mm.
We can't accept 70 million people. Europe accepted over 1 million in 1 year, and it caused a lot of political and economic dislocation there. we probably could accept more than the 100,000 or so refugees that we formally accept in a year at the peak. And right now, our last year, we only accepted maybe 15,000. We could do better than that. But just an established refugee program that screens people overseas for their needs and their fears and their need for protection and brings people in is not going to be adequate, right? Then we've got people who come to seek asylum. They come on a temporary visa or a tourist visa or something, and they stay. And then those who come up from Central America. It's different programs for different groups of people. In the Central American case, this administration is committed, as the Obama administration was, less so the Trump administration, to trying to make Central America a better place to live, to deal with the corruption, the instability, the gang violence, narco trafficking, all of that. It's a lot of things. Hurricanes have hit these countries recently. Development's a long-term prospect. So in the meantime, we have to think about, okay, there's going to be great demand for people, or a great supply of asylum seekers and others who want to come from Central America. How do we channel that flow? Well, first, again, getting back to the major weakness, we need an asylum system that doesn't take 5 years, maybe takes 5 months to determine whether or not someone really has a reason to claim asylum based on, whether it be religious persecution, race ethnic persecution, persecution by the government, or some other form of persecution or fear of persecution. But that will be a narrow channel. Not everyone will qualify for that. Most people want the better life in the United States. They can earn many times as much as they can earn, have a much more stable job and livelihood here. So we need new economic pathways. We need to expand those programs I mentioned earlier, the agricultural workers program, programs to bring in workers in the hospitality and restaurants and places like that on a limited basis, but bring them in from Central America, get them screened in advance, link them to jobs here in the US so they're not just showing up at the border. That'll be in their interest, and it'll be in our interest to help manage the flow. That's not going to handle everybody. People will still try to come. So we also need to have a credible, border security system. We need to have a system that can find people when they're crossing the border, detect them, apprehend them, determine if they have a valid reason to come. And for those who don't, some of them will be deported. We need a balance in that. We need a better managed system at the border. It's a lot to do. It's not something that will happen overnight. But I think we need all of those components in place to manage this flow right now. The other thing I would say is that on the demand side, as we're coming out of this pandemic-induced recession, we are seeing demand for workers. We are seeing very, low ratio of available jobs to people. High numbers of jobs available compared to the people who are seeking those jobs, even though we still have unemployment and we still have people who are not in the labor force. We have a demographic transition with a lowering birth rate. That means that the people born in the United States are probably not going to be able to fill all the jobs that are coming in the future if we have strong growth. So the demand will be there. The supply is there. The trick is how to link it in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, this is touches on a topic that I always have debates with my brother about, who tends to be a little bit more conservative than me. And he's always railing against unauthorized immigration. And I also believe there should be a structured, organized way to manage this. One thing I've tried to emphasize to him is that I think a lot of us are benefiting from unauthorized labor subsidizing, our ability to buy a lot of things for very low costs. And it's often, I feel like it's overlooked. And I lived for many years in Switzerland, where they're very hardcore about labor rules. And Swiss labor gets paid top dollar but that results in you go to get a hamburger, and literally it could be like darn near $20. And I remember when I first got there, I was like, man, this is crazy. But then when you think about, okay, well, the waitress, the cooks, the people, working on the farms, they're all getting paid a living wage. And then you come back here and you're like, wow, there's a lot of the supply chain that is working at sort of very low wages. And that allows us to get our $2 burger. But it's sort of an unseen subsidy. Do you think there's any truth to that? Or maybe is there a nuance that I'm missing and that you can kind of shine a light on as well?
Yeah, so speaking on a broader
Yeah.
level, we have one of the most unequal economies of any major industrial nation in terms of the gap between the highest and lowest paid people. Very low minimum wage that's not kept pace with inflation over the years is part of that story. That's another topic for conversation.
Mhm.
But so is unauthorized immigrant employment. When you have 7 to 8 billion people who are working in the shadows in the economy, it's hard to organize them into labor unions. It's hard for them to advocate for better wages and better working conditions. They're subject to exploitation. And so are their coworkers. So having a large group of unauthorized immigrant workers is not beneficial to the working class in the United States. It would be much more beneficial if those workers were legalized or had another way to come in legally. And also on just the broader social side, the fact that people are living in the shadows, that they do experience a risk of deportation. That varies depending on which administration's in power, but they're living these high risk lives being in the U.S. Many immigrants, and that does make it hard, I think, for certain communities where they live, for certain sectors of society are affected by that. I mean, it's particularly the Latino population more broadly, because to be honest, most of the unauthorized immigrants, and certainly those who are talked about the most, who are most visible politically, are Latino, and their family members may be legal, they may be citizens. Their neighbors are often legal and citizens, but if there are undocumented immigrants there in their midst, that affects that whole community. And I think that does hold down wages. It can be an economic benefit, but the degree to which it means that a lot of American workers are earning less, it's negatively affecting some people as well as affecting people positively.
What would happen if the government were enforcing employment laws more effectively and there was less demand for unauthorized workers? Do you think that would actually what would happen? Would that impact the number of people coming in, or why hasn't that been, like, the last administration was always talking about the problem at the border? And I guess I've always felt like, well, if if folks know that there are jobs available and they don't need to get a green card, they don't need to get any kind of authorization, then they're doing a rational thing. And why not just go to the source of the demand, the employers? Like, we don't talk about illegal employers, but those employers knowingly hiring unauthorized workers are kind of breaking the law. But we don't talk about them as much. What's going on there?
Well, yes. In theory, if people couldn't work illegally, they wouldn't have a way to support themselves in the United
Hmm.
States, and they would actually leave, those who are here, many of them. And at times they have, like the Mexican unauthorized immigrant population has gone down a fair amount, by some counts as much as 2 million over the last 10 to 15 years. And that started during that Great Recession in 2008, 9, because it couldn't get jobs anymore.
Right.
And other, Central Americans have come in, but there's been some reduction in that unauthorized immigrant population because of declines in the types of jobs that people do. So that's evidence that it could happen. The problem then becomes, well, how do you actually really do it? right? So 1986, now we're talking 35 years ago, there was a major legalization bill. The Immigration Reform and Control Act legalized close to 3 million unauthorized immigrants, but also required employers to verify the status of everyone that worked for them. That's that I-9 form that everyone has to fill when they get a job, and they have to show their identification. So that was supposed to be the answer, but the problem was that, and the idea was, well, by doing the paperwork, employers are complying. If they're not doing the paperwork, then they're knowingly hiring someone illegally. Well, you get forged documents, right? That's what happened. People just forged the documents. The employers filed the paperwork. There were, there were mills there, where they were producing false documents. Verifying was only as good as the paper it was put on. So now they created E-Verify, do it electronically, verify the documents electronically to get around the forgery of the paper documents. So you could still forge the documents online. Now they're trying to work towards biometrics, somebody's fingerprint or eye scan or something that proves who they really are. But it's hard to do for those technical reasons. The second reason why is because we as a country have a highly unregulated workforce. We're not Switzerland. We're not Japan. We're not Germany. We're not a country where it takes a lot of work to hire someone and it's difficult to fire them. We have a very open labor market, at will employment in most states, very minimal regulation, minimal oversight of the hours that people are worked, minimal oversight of the working conditions. This has come out in the pandemic, for instance, the meat processing plants. With unauthorized workers, a lot of times they don't even get paid. There's a lot of wage theft. There's wage theft for other low-income workers too. So we just historically have had a very lightly regulated labor market, and that's flexible. It responds quickly. It responded quickly to the pandemic. It bounced back very quickly after the pandemic. Hiring and firing is very easy, but that lacks worker protections. And so if you don't really have those two things hand in hand, a way to truly verify that someone is working legally and they are who they are, and you're actually regulating employers and you're checking all these other things like wages and working conditions, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I remember there was one moment in the previous administration where there was a pretty public crackdown of a meat packing facility. And do you know if there was like large penalties sort of assigned to the employer to kind of create a disincentive to do it? Or do you think maybe the employer was completely surprised and they were just presented really great fake documentation? Or do you think they were complicit?
Well, it's hard to know. Yeah, in that last case, you're thinking of those, I think, 6 plants in Mississippi that were all raided at the same time. I think, again, I think there was some evidence that people were using fraudulent documents, and they had to have gotten them from somewhere. And did an individual plant supervisor, plant manager, were they in on it? Do they know about it? That's possible. Did the company know? Were they turning a blind eye? To my knowledge, there weren't any major fines against the company. I think there were some, but there were several hundred people who got arrested and put in detention, and some of them were deported. You could go back to the actual biggest single worksite raid that the U.S. has had was in Postville, Iowa in 2008. It was a kosher meatpacking plant. Rubashkin, I don't remember his first name, was one of the plant owners and managers who was actually indicted on several counts of not just hiring people illegally and mistreating them, but a number of other things. That's a case where the plant management definitely knew they were doing something wrong. And a number of the immigrant workers actually got visas as victims of crime because of the way they were treated by the plant. Well, he was in jail. Rubashkin was in jail, and he got a clemency from President Trump. President Trump actually exonerated him of those crimes. So that's sending a clear signal to the worst of the worst employers. So it's
Yeah.
always been mixed. That's just the most egregious example, but it's always been mixed. There's been a lot of turning a blind eye to employers while focusing on arresting the immigrants who are working. But that said, the actual number of worksite arrests of unauthorized immigrants is very small under any administration. It was highest under the Bush administration, but it was just amounted to maybe 10,000. When we're deporting several 100,000 people a year from the
Mm-hmm.
border that are brought in because they've committed another crime or been accused of committing a crime in the US, we've never in any administration done very significant numbers of worksite arrests. And it's hard to do
Yeah.
that too. It's hard to do that. The actual logistics of launching a worksite operation are really tough.
The other thing that I was curious about, Randy, is this notion that, of course, we started as a country with vast amounts of land and a massive economic growth engine and a need for labor. So the notion of, bring me your huddled masses, like, makes tons of sense. We are no longer, in a boom the way we might have been, in the 19th and early 20th century. Do you feel like we need to rethink our immigration approach? Like, as much as I did not agree with much of what Trump said, I do think a merit-based immigration lens is worth considering. I know from working in the private sector that there have been many times where, you get this PhD from MIT or Stanford, but they happen to be a citizen of Korea or Germany, and then you can't hire them. So then they go back to their home country and build a competitor. and it's just like, and you can't find, great artificial intelligence engineers like around the block. Like they're a rarity. And so I'm just wondering, like, what do you think is the approach we need to take while still maintaining uh, and acknowledging our history of being a very open place where it is a place of opportunity, but then lining that up with what the economy needs?
Yeah, to unpack it, I mean, I think that's a number of questions, and the
Yeah,
first one is on how much land and resources do we have? Clearly,
yeah,
this is not the 19th century, and we're not sending people out. California is
right.
where you live is
Yeah,
crowded, and people are actually leaving because of that. It's getting housing is getting expensive everywhere, so there are limits, and that's why you can't just let everybody come across the border. You need to manage it. That's why you can only let immigration grow so fast. But as I mentioned earlier, our birth rate's down to something like 1.6 children per woman, and it needs to be about over 2 for the population just to stay
right.
the same, right? If it gets small the way it has, I think the most extreme example of this is some Asian countries. In Russia, it actually shrinks
Mm,
rapidly, and a shrinking population is really bad for the economy because the proportion that's shrinking is the younger working people, and the portion
right.
that's growing is the older people, becomes top heavy and less productive. And that's given Japan a lot of issues. It's given some European. You can't stay competitive. You don't have innovation if you don't have young people coming in large numbers. So now you need people. I think there's widespread agreement with most people. You need the highly skilled, as you mentioned, the entrepreneurs, the people with the new ideas, people who can implement things, people in specialty occupations. That's the idea behind the H-1B program. That's a system management issue that's not great because there are gaps between who comes as a student, who can stay as a temporary H-1B or other high skilled worker, who can stay permanently. That could be, it's not a smooth system in the US. So we definitely lose some people. During times when there's pushback against international students, as there was in the Trump administration, we lose more. The US
Mm,
becomes a less friendly place for foreign students. We have fewer now than we did 5 years ago. And so they go to Canada, they go to Europe, they go to another country, and then we're losing in the global competition for talent. And so we need to win that to stay where we have been in the pole position of, as the strongest economy in the world. We have to have that talent. And so I think there's widespread agreement. Where there's less agreement is on how many lower skilled workers we need. There's clearly demand again, supply coming from
Mm-hmm.
Central America, increasingly coming from other parts of the world, but we need people there too. In California, some of the agricultural land is just not worth using for agriculture anymore. Now, there's a water issue involved in that right now that may continue with the drought and with the climate change. But some agricultural land goes out of production because if farmers can't find the workers they need, they move the production to Mexico or South America. More and more of our produce, you look on the store shelves, it's coming from outside the US. One can argue if that's good or bad, but that's an example of losing part of our economy to other countries because we don't have an adequate agricultural workforce. There's risk for that in manufacturing. There's, in the service industries, there's risk for that as well. And then the final element to throw into the mix is automation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Automation can change a lot of things. We're talking about self-driving cars, self-driving delivery vans. We've already had a lot of changes with the pandemic and how we receive things. We don't go to the store to buy things. They're delivered to our doorstep by Amazon and other companies, right? So it evolves. And what we need to do when we're making our policies for immigration is to have the immigration policies evolve with the economy. And that's where I think we've fallen short. We need to be able to look at trends in the labor market and adjust the numbers of people we admit with certain skills based on what the labor market needs. That's where the primary weakness of the legal immigration system is right now.
Are there areas where you think both parties can agree to make reform? Because it seems like it has been simplified to either, if you're in one camp, you say, hey, the country is being overwhelmed and immigrants are pouring in and taking all the good jobs, yada yada. Or the other camp where you're saying, hey, it's completely inhumane, we should accept as many people as there are people. And then the system just rewards this kind of polarization, and then they win their primaries, and we have the Congress that we have. Are there areas where moderates or centrists or reform-minded people who just want to like move the ball, a few yards and get a first down? Is there anything we can do that you think both sides would be okay with?
Yes, I mean, I think there are. I mean, I think they've been proposed in some cases, not passed, but in some cases we have programs that are evolving where we are letting in more agricultural workers than we have in the past. And there's some bipartisan agreement that we should legalize some of the unauthorized agricultural workers, that would be a good place to start. Rural economies, which tend to be more conservative, more Republican, are more dependent on farm labor. So that's one area. A second is at the other end is with the DACA, the deferred action, or the dreamers, the higher skilled, better educated people who are unauthorized but came to the U.S. as children. And there's generally been agreement that they should have a way to stay in the U.S. permanently and lawfully. Border politics get mixed up in that, but those are two starting points. Another starting point could be, as we were discussing, the international students and providing a smoother pathway for them to stay and get into higher skilled jobs. So there are a number of points on which there's been agreement in the past. Where it gets hard is when it comes down to two things, which is what's the overall number? How many immigrants do we want to let in? Do we want to let that number grow? Does it need to shrink? And that's kind of why it stayed about the same in terms of the number of lawful permanent residents coming in, and we haven't changed that architecture of the main flows of legal immigrants in a long time, because you've got these sides. One side wants to shrink it, one side wants to grow it. So the overall number is a sticking point. And the second thing is the unauthorized immigrant population. It's the degree to which there should be strict border enforcement and a wall and, expulsions like we have now because of the pandemic that just push everybody back to Mexico, where that should be a permanent kind of policy, which is what Trump was trying to do, whether asylum seekers should be let in at all. And then if they do get in, how easy is it for them to make their case? That's tough, because that's also significant numbers of people, and it's hard to determine systematically who has a valid asylum case. And then, when people are in the U.S. illegally, should they have a way to stay, or should they be forced to return to their home countries? There's a lot of disagreement on that. If once you get beyond that deferred action DACA group to the broader unauthorized immigrant population, there's always been a lot of disagreement on whether people who are in the country illegally should be allowed to stay. And those, I think, tend to be the border, the numbers, the unauthorized population are the sticking points.
So I'm not hearing, when I look at today's political parties, I just wonder, like, if you're sitting in Congress and let's say you want to take on, hey, let's make it easier for people getting advanced degrees in the US to work for American companies. It makes sense, I think. But if you're a Republican, you're going to be primaried saying, oh, you're soft on immigration, regardless of the facts. Like, you could try and explain, no, I was just talking about PhDs in engineering. And then if you're a Democrat and you go for that, they're going to say, well, you don't care about kids in cages. And then you get primaried. Have you seen any action so far around these common sense kind of like low-hanging fruit opportunities? Or you seem optimistic, and maybe I'm just becoming too cynical.
Well, I mean, I'm optimistic in terms of the options that are out there. I'm not optimistic in terms of the dynamics in Congress and the dynamics in the elections. And so those are two different things. I do every now and then, there are the old voices, the Lindsey Grahams, the Marco Rubios, senators who signed on to comprehensive immigration reform in a bipartisan fashion.
Yeah.
The last round, and they're pulling back because they're getting that pressure from the right wing. And then you've also got people on the Democratic side that are calling to abolish ICE. They don't want any border enforcement. Everyone should come in. I think they're smaller in number than those on the right wing side of it, but they are pulling the party in that direction. But there are pragmatists. There's, for instance, there's a new, and I'm blanking on her name now, though. There's a new representative from Florida who's a Republican. It was Donna Shalala's district as a Democrat, and she's, I think, South American immigrant background, but Salazar, I believe, is her last name, who's proposed a limited
Maria Elvira Salazar.
Yes, who has proposed what on the face of it would be a workable middle ground in favor of a rapid pathway to citizenship for the deferred action for the DACA group, a longer pathway that would be earned legalization that would take more than 10 years for other unauthorized immigrants who qualify, and many of them would. It's not that different from the last comprehensive round of immigration reform. But, as we've seen with others within the Republican Party in particular, she's also a border hawk. So the idea is that we would have to prove that the border is fully secure before we could start legalizing anybody. And that's hard because you have to define what's a secure border. Does that mean no one comes across between the ports of entry at all, ever? Does that mean 1,000, 10,000? Where do you draw that line? And how do you get that number down there without putting kids in cages or sending them to refugee camps under overpasses at the border and the Mexican side, back into the hands of the cartels and kidnappers? And, how do you have a humane border policy and still get the border under control first before you can start legalizing anyone? But it does represent a middle ground. It represents, we can be tough on border security, and we can also legalize people who are here to maximize their contributions and make their lives better. And so, I mean, that's a creative way of thinking. That's kind of the way forward down the middle. but it's difficult. It's difficult because of the situation at the border right now. And that's new blood in the Republican Party. You did have a very high turnout for Republicans among Latinos
Mm-hmm.
in Florida and Texas.
Yeah.
And that's a message to both parties. I think it's a message to the Democrats that being all in on super progressive on immigration may not sell with all of the Latino electorate. And it's a message, the Karl Rove message going back to the George W. Bush years to the Republican Party, that there are a fair number of Latinos who are natural Republican voters, and that you could pull them in if you were more moderate on immigration. So that kind of gives me hope. The other side of the story is then you've got all the other voters in Florida and Texas versus, say, against those in California and New York, are very polarized on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, I know your focus, Randy, is on the U.S. I am curious, like, what is going on in Mexico? They are almost serving as this buffer area. How are they handling all of this immigration from south of them going through their country and then kind of clogging up at the border as well?
So 15 to 20 years ago, virtually all the unauthorized immigrants coming across the border were Mexican.
Mm.
And so the Mexican government took a position of the freedom of movement and very much against border control, and that they weren't going to stop people from leaving if they needed to have a better life. And the issue of migrants transiting across Mexico was not a big issue. Now it is. So the first really big group of Central Americans to come across and seek asylum was in 2014. Toward the end of the Obama administration. In 2015 was the first time that Mexico started deporting large numbers of people. The Mexican government started to arrest and detain and deport people back to Central America in big numbers. And that brought the number coming all the way to the US down somewhat in 2015 and 2016. And that was sort of the first moment when, we've had cooperation with Mexico, the US and Mexican governments, on drug enforcement and trafficking of weapons and goods for years, for decades. Yeah. Then it started to become cooperation on migration management as well. Mexico's started to build an asylum system of its own. It's not nearly as large as the US system. It's also slow and cumbersome, but some people get grants of asylum to stay in the US. And Mexico has agricultural jobs that need workers in the southern part of the country that Guatemalans get work permits for. In some parts of northern Mexico, there are industrial jobs that need workers. Their birth rate has also come down, so they don't have a growing labor force the way they used to. So some people could stay in Mexico. So they're playing this kind of gatekeeper role. It was complicated by the Trump administration putting pressure on the renegotiation of NAFTA, threatening tariffs, and a number of other things. And it was just odd. It was like it was like an odd couple with Lopez Obrador, who's a leftist populist, and Trump, who's a rightist populist in the US, working together to control migration. That was something that was unique that we didn't think we'd see, but that set a precedent. And now with the Biden administration, of course, they are still working with Mexico to convince them to keep people in Mexican territory, to deport people back to Central America to the degree that they can. And even though we've opened the door to more asylum seekers, particularly children, we still have it shut for most adults. And that's really relying on Mexico to do the heavy lifting to take care of that population.
Yeah, it's super interesting how, we always think about our border is the last southern border, but Mexico has its own southern border challenges as well.
Well, yeah. And so as Mexico has grown and despite all the difficulties that they're having, their standard of living is much higher than it is in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Despite the corruption and the crime, it's more dangerous south of their border. And so that is it's a narrow area that people can cross there. It is a real restriction point. Now, where it starts to get interesting is that people from Honduras and El Salvador and others have to travel through Guatemala to get to Mexico. So
Mm-hmm.
we have started to work on migration management with the Guatemalan government to
Mm.
see if they would stop people. And they did during the pandemic simply because they didn't want people with the coronavirus traveling through. So Guatemala becomes the next point. If you go further south, migrants coming from South America and even from other parts of the world who fly into South America, they have to travel through Panama and Costa Rica to get to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and up to Mexico. And so we also have been, the US government has been negotiating with those countries to control northward flows. So that the border is to degrees being pushed further and further south through Central America.
Is there talk about the U.S. providing foreign aid to Mexico to further secure its southern border? Because it seems like it's easier, might be easier for them just in terms of number of miles to get a handle on that than our southern border, which seems to be broader.
Yeah, I don't think that the Mexican government would be in a position politically to accept funding for that from the US.
Uh-huh.
That would be hard. I mean, we've seen things change a lot under the new Mexican president. It's always possible.
Yeah.
They've been deploying their own National Guard for that, and that National Guard's been redeployed from other security activities around the country, and they may be asking questions about that. We have talked about providing resources through international Organization for Migration, IOM, and
Mm.
UNHCR, to help assist refugees and asylum seekers in Mexico. That's something that past Mexican administrations haven't agreed to either, which is
Mm.
international organizations assisting with refugees within their territory. But that's another area. And then, AMLO, the Mexican president, is really invested in this idea of developing southern Mexico and Central America together as a region, investing in infrastructure, the
Mm-hmm.
big Maya rail project, for instance, investing in sustainable agriculture in the region. And migration's part of that picture too. And that's one area where he would really like to get US government and US private sector investment into the region. And that's something the Biden administration has been in negotiations about.
Oh, that could be a win-win. Sounds like a business opportunity, and it would help improve conditions down there as well.
Well, people would say that, with the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that had some dislocation of American workers for sure in manufacturing,
Mm-hmm.
and had some dislocation of Mexican workers in agriculture, though some of that's moved back. It did disrupt labor markets, but in the long run, it helped Mexico develop a very vibrant manufacturing sector, which is a key employer there, and raise living standards and employment opportunities, and reduce the push factor for migration out of Mexico. Could something like that work in Central America, getting private sector investment, getting manufacturing employment to grow in those countries? You run up against issues of corruption. It's not really a fully free market. It's highly risky to invest in a place like Guatemala or Honduras right now. The drug trafficking that's going on, a lot of those things can get in the way. But in the longer term, the hope is that some kind of a sustainable development program would raise living standards and reduce the need for people to leave. Now, it's not going to work in the short run, right? It's going to take a while. It took good solid 20, 25 years in Mexico, and might take even longer in Central America because the starting point of level of development is lower. But it's important to be looking at the longer term picture and looking at development no matter what we do in the shorter term.
Last question for you, Randy, before we wrap up. Have you seen any other countries implement strategies to better manage immigration that we should consider adopting here? Or is everybody else also struggling with this and there's no silver bullet?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think it's a best practice. The Europeans have struggled with the asylum seekers. They're up against a much tougher issue, which is that across the Mediterranean is Africa, which is the fastest growing continent population wise, with a much lower standard of living than we have even in Central America, plus Asia. And they have invested in trying to push their border out to Turkey, letting Turkey be the gatekeeper, kind of the way Mexico is for the U.S. Well, then you start making deals with the devil. You start allowing Turkey to become involved in Syria. You wind up with problems of the change in the political system in Turkey, which has gotten worse. You make deals with countries like Libya, which is in a very anarchic situation since the overthrow of Gaddafi, and you have migrants who are kept there in horrible conditions. But if they stay in Libya, they're not coming to Europe. So this idea that you could find, they've been thinking about safe havens for migrants that are not in their home countries where it isn't safe, but they don't come all the way to Europe, and finding a safe haven in somewhere in between the U.S., maybe in Mexico, maybe in Central America, that's fraught with all sorts of difficulties as to whether it really is safe. But that's one idea. Another idea on the legal immigration side that the merit-based, as you mentioned it earlier, and this was came out during the Trump administration in favor of some policies that were proposed in legislation, is a points-based system or other system to allocate more visas to people with higher education, with English language skills, with other valuable work skills, to weigh that more heavily than the family ties, which are the main reason that people get to immigrate to the U.S. We've argued that MPI has an institution that just assigning points to skills doesn't match people necessarily as well with labor market needs, because you could wind up with a lot of PhDs that are underemployed because, or a lot of doctors that are underemployed because there aren't jobs for them. So we would argue that it might be some combination of giving some credit for people with certain skills, the credit for family ties, but also importantly, making sure that there is a job available that matches their skills, that kind of a reform. And that's hard to do because, the United Kingdom tried to do that. They reviewed their labor conditions every 2 years or so to see, okay, well, right now we're going to need more chemical engineers because we're short on chemical engineers. We're short on nursing assistants, so we'll open up more visas specifically for those jobs. But by the time they've analyzed the data and opened up and gotten the visas, the labor market's changed,
right?
And it's rapidly evolving. So keeping pace with it is difficult. But that's another thing that you can do, is you can review labor market data on a regular basis and use that to adjust the immigration system. And that's an idea that we've proposed here for the U.S. None of these things are easy to do. None of them are perfect. But I think there are good options out there.
I have to ask you, have we ever thought about a market-based approach where employers bid for visas, and then, if they were going to add a lot of value, a company should be willing to pay a significant amount of money for
Yeah,
that
that's
visa?
that's been discussed. I mean, that's definitely been discussed as an option. I haven't heard of that being implemented on a broad scale anywhere.
Right.
And that's also hard to mix and match. The bidding approach is harder to mix and match with the humanitarian approach, looking at asylum seekers, with a family-based approach. But it is one way. It is one way, and it could be something to try in one of the narrower temporary programs, like the people have talked about converting the H-1B program, where there's just a lot of really rigid technical qualifications that go into reviewing someone's application as to whether or not they are this high-skilled temporary worker, versus just allowing companies to bid. You set a floor under the qualifications and everyone could bid on that. It could work in something like H-1B. You could experiment with it, but you're always going to get accusations then that only the highest bidders, the big companies, the people with the the biggest resources are the ones that are going to be able to afford that. It's going to be harder for smaller companies, for startups, for innovators to get workers that way. Another issue that we haven't talked about yet is geography. Silicon Valley, which is near where you live, Washington, D.C., near where I live, New York, like the big economic centers, they would drive a system like that. And actually, they kind of do drive the H-1B program right now. A lot of the immigrants move to where the economy is strongest, and then you have these pockets all around the U.S. where economies are weaker. And so one of the other things people have talked about is how to do a regional approach to create an immigration program that, for the Midwest, where there is population decline and aging, to bring in immigrants there to try to revitalize the economy. That's a more nuanced approach, and probably, a highest bidder approach wouldn't work for that. So that's just another consideration. And any of these potential reforms to the immigration system have strengths and weaknesses.
Randy, it has been quite a pleasure learning about all of the interesting perspectives and in a very objective, calm conversation about immigration. So very refreshing and thought provoking. People should check out migrationpolicy.org because you guys publish a lot of fact sheets and kind of research on these issues, and it seems like there is. One thing is like, it's like healthcare reform. Like there's no one single answer and you really got to get into it. Sadly, I don't know that our current political system rewards that, but we all need it to solve these problems and make it sustainable. So I'm grateful that you're out there trying to spread, information and logic and evidence, and hopefully this conversation will get shared out and liked. And so if you're watching this live, remember to like and share. And if you're on replay, comment below and let us know if you think there's one thing that both parties can agree to in the next few years. Like, how do we make progress here? Because we just can't keep yelling at each other. Any last thoughts, Randy, before we wrap up?
Well, I do think, thanks for the invitation. I do, we do try to take the nerdy point of view on this, because we have the numbers and we do have a lot of data on our homepage that you just showed. We have a lot of policy proposals. We're trying to provide the background and the space for people to think about this, think about the options, think about a middle ground. Well, as you're showing here, we also do a lot of research on education and other means of integration for immigrant populations.
Yeah.
And it's not just important to think about who do we let into the country and how do we handle the struggles at the border. It's also, what happens after people get here? How could they effectively integrate? And we look at those issues as well. There's always going to be a lot of heat in this space. There's always a lot of emotion. That's probably not going away anytime soon. It may even get worse, but we also want to try to shed light on it and hope that, with more light than heat, that some people will be able to see that way forward, and make some changes.
Yeah, we could do a whole nother interview down the road about how do we think about assimilation and sort of post immigration kind of integration into the host country. And I might harken back to my few years I lived in Switzerland, and it's not easy integrating.
I do think, as I said before, we do have an old immigration system that its foundation is still kind of strong, but it needs a lot of reform. I think our kind of a lack of a system is a beneficial thing when it comes to immigrant integration. I actually think, we have issues, but I think we avoid a lot of the major problems that many of the European countries have with immigrant integration because we have a more open economy and society. We can have that conversation another time. But the fact that people can come here and work and earn a basic living and go about their lives, despite all the other faults, is a real strength of the American system.
Agree. Well, Randy, with that, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Okay, goodbye, nerds, and thanks for the nerdy questions.
I love it. Take care, buddy.
All right.